Tucker Carlson was doing a segment on his show about the Postal Service and how they're getting a particular department of the Postal Service to specifically deal with elections, and because mail-in voting is a huge thing, have kind of a specialized part of the Postal Service that focuses on that. And it got them on a rant about how mail-in ballots is pretty much just bad, horrible, terrible, and it opens you up to fraud. Now, listen, I understand that in theory, that kind of sounds true. Because when you go into an in-person voting booth, that seems more secure. And then when someone says, oh, imagine if you're just mailing it, that could cause fraud a lot easier. That sounds true. Luckily, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. We've had mail-in voting for a very long time. And it's very effective. And in my view, and I'll get into this more as this segment goes on, my view is we have to balance, or not even balance. We have to do kind of a balancing act is the way to say it, of getting as many people able to vote as easily as possible without, breaching the security of our elections, right? Without seeing a significant amount of fraud. And if we can do that, we're doing good. I think this move by the right, based on all the election lies of just like, we don't want that many people to vote. And this was always, in recent history, the move of the Republican Party because it benefited them for there to be less voter turnout for a number of reasons. And so there's kind of this push towards, hey, democracy isn't it for everybody? It's not a great thing if a lot of people get active in our democracy. And then, of course, you hear kind of in the farther right part of the internet, this feeling of only certain people should be able to vote, like only men, or even more specific than that, which is such a slide backwards. It hurts my brain, but that's just something that's happening these days. We move forward a lot on some fronts, and it seems to coincide with the saddest slide backwards in other parts of our country. But anyways, so in this rant, Tucker Carlson says, if you can't get yourself to the polls, you shouldn't have the right to vote, or you shouldn't have that, privilege to go and vote. And it's such a fascinating statement because it reveals kind of his perception of voting, and also can quickly be laughed at, because you think about, what if someone who isn't in good enough physical health to vote, are they not an American? Are they not someone who has the right to vote? Are they not someone who should have their voice heard? I feel like that's a pretty easy thing to understand. Or I know if you pressed him on this, he would go, oh, well, of course the military, but military people mail in vote because they're in other countries. I think that's great. Well, they should fly back and vote in a voting booth, Tucker Carlson, I guess, is saying. Here, let's take a look. So I'm just starting at mid comment from this contributor so that we can get to Tucker Carlson's statement.
Special division created in the Postal Service to deal with election mail. And Tucker, I just don't think that people should be trusting the Postal Service with their mail-in ballots. They ought to be voting in person with government-issued ID to be totally safe.
Why is there any mail-in balloting? If you can't be bothered to get to the polls, why do you have a right to participate in democracy? I don't understand. I mean, it's just an invitation to fraud. They support it because it allows fraud. Why are Republicans putting up with this?
No, it is not an invitation for fraud, and it is not allowing fraud, because the counting process of our ballots is so good, because the verification of an individual voter as you're going down the line and counting votes and getting them in the system is good, is effective. The actual process of getting the vote to the voting place is not as much of a concern, right? You don't have to necessarily be there if the process on the other end is secure, which it is. And we see time and time again, whenever they make these claims, and then we look into our elections, especially 2020, it was a safe election. And as I've mentioned before, when you have millions of people voting, there's going to be some instance of someone going and doing something wrong. Someone trying to vote twice, someone dropping a mail-in ballot into the voting booth and then also going in person. And guess what? They get caught for it. They have. I've seen instances, the tiny little handful of instances where people have either purposefully or accidentally done some sort of voter fraud, get caught for it. And it's individuals. It's not some big massive plan. And many of the instances that have come to the surface have actually been people trying to vote for Trump twice because they're like, well, if Democrats are going to cheat, then I'm going to cheat too. And they got caught for it, and they should be held accountable for that. But that is not an indictment on our system, because especially if they're getting caught for it, we're not actually swaying elections with those holes in the system that you might consider them to be. So very interesting from Tucker Carlson. For me, the more this conversation has gone on, the more I get swayed to, why don't we just make it as easy as possible for people to vote? Now, we have to have security, so it's not going to be remarkably easy. You can't go on your computer and vote, on the day of the election, and that's okay, because we do have to have secure elections, and we do have to make sure that people don't fraudulently vote. But if we're not seeing significant levels of fraud and you can get people voting easier, awesome. And mail-in voting is an example of that. It allows, even like I said, maybe older people who have a hard time getting to the polls, or someone in bad health, that's kind of, goes together, or even just someone who wants to do it that way because they want to do it that way. It's a really amazing way to expand the process to more people. And that, in a democratic process like we have, is beautiful. And as long as it's not riddled with fraud, or not, being corrupted in some way, then it is a good system. And so this belief by the Republican Party that we should get all the way back to just in-person voting is pretty crazy, considering that for a long time it was high Republican population that was voting by mail. Now that's kind of changed based on all of Trump's claims about mail-in voting, but that was the case. And I think that's totally great and totally fine. And as I said, I like the idea of getting as many voices of the American people heard.